Amazing. Thank you so much, Mike. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session on Teams and data loss prevention. I'm really happy to be here. It's actually my first time presenting at the Canadian Cloud Summit, so I'm really excited to be running through the session with you. Before I start, we do have to thank our sponsors. Without our sponsors, obviously, we wouldn't be able to run types of events like this, so you can see their logos on screen. So thank you very much for supporting this event. A bit of fun as well before we kick off is if you use the QR code, and there's a link in there as well, if you submit feedback about the event, you've actually got a chance to win a $50 Amazon gift card. So I could always do with that. So please make sure you provide your feedback. It's always very valuable. If you do have any questions, as Mike's mentioned in the chat, please feel free to pop them as we go, and I'm happy to stop and, do it a little bit less formal. So yeah, please feel free to pop the chat in. You can interrupt me and I'll pause and we'll answer questions as we go through, but we will have time at the end to go for any questions as well. Just to introduce myself, so I'm Kat Greenan and I'm a Microsoft Solutions Specialist based in the UK. I specialise in Microsoft Teams and have been kind of frequently speaking at conferences for just over the last year or so, both virtually and in person, hopefully sharing some knowledge on Microsoft Teams. If you do want to find out any Teams tips and any kind of, what's new in Microsoft Teams, please feel free to follow my blog. It's collabwithcat.com. And I'm also a co-host on a podcast called Cloud Conversations, where we talk about Microsoft 365, not just Teams, but all things M365. We have some great guests on there. Please check us out on YouTube. I have added some social media on the right-hand side. So I'm on Twitter at Greenan. I'm on LinkedIn as well. If you want to search me, please connect. I really like to expand my network. So if you want to follow, I try to post updates about new things that are coming to Teams. So please feel free to do so. Alrighty, what we're going to cover today. So it's all about Teams and DLP, data loss prevention, and how we can use data loss prevention, what we can do with it, why it's important, and how does that work with Teams. So we're going to start with some compliance challenges. We do have to set a little bit of context before we dive into the tech and understand what DLP actually is, what it does, why it's important. We will be showing a live demo. So I'm going to show you both from the administrator side, how to set up a policy, what can we do with it, and also from the end user. So how does the end user consume that kind of technology? What happens if they do, there is a policy match from their perspective? Then I want to talk about what's new. It's not necessarily to do with Teams, but in DLP, there's lots of new functionality that it's definitely worth being aware of. And one of the questions I always get asked in these types of sessions is licensing. What licensing do I need to get this technology? And I will be going through that in a bit of detail with you as well. So to start, as more and more employees, we're shifting now to work remotely. And it's more important than ever that, as organizations, we prioritize protecting all of our critical, sensitive data. And that's across applications, it's across endpoints, and it's across cloud services. And if you think about how your employees are accessing your data, they're accessing, sharing, creating, and storing data in lots of new ways than they did before. And what we need to do is really make sure that this is being done in a protected and compliant manner. There's been a huge growth of corporate data as well, and that's because we're remote working. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're protecting and governing the data and managing risk to that digital transformation that we're all kind of going through now. What we really must rely on in terms of business continuity is our employees to, be able to stay connected and productive. And that's really outside of the traditional digital borders of business that we're so used to doing maybe, a few years ago now. And in doing so, what we need to really look at doing is identify and manage any potential risks so we can safeguard that data and also support a positive company culture. One thing we do not want to do is block anyone from doing anything, and so users can't get the work done. Now, traditionally, organizations, we would use documents and emails to communicate, which was nice and easy and simple enough anyway. But now we're handling things like instant messages, channel messages and Teams. It's a whole different way of communicating, video files, images, and lots more. And Microsoft officials have, given us, I think these stats have actually increased in terms of the monthly active usage, but 250 million monthly active users. And that's shot up last year from the 145 million daily active user total that was hit. And what that means is that with more users sharing information on Teams, the ability to share information with people outside the organization and invite guests now into our teams, the chance of data leakage is greater. And not only that, the challenge of there's lots of different types of data. Our employees are working from home, they're accessing their data from different places. Discovering and managing data is difficult as well. I mean, we've got to figure out what data we actually have, what is sensitive to us. There's no point putting a policy in place to protect financial data if you just don't store it or share it or work with it as an organization. And so really what we need to look at is data that's sensitive and protect that data and really look at the different priorities as an organization as well. But just finding that information can be challenging. Where is it located? How is it being shared? And also a problem is that 80% of our data is dark. So, I mean, there's no wonder that 88% of organizations have no confidence that they can detect and prevent loss of sensitive data. And if you add to that the climate of remote work, data being shared for non-managed devices as well, personal devices and different non-corporate locations, that problem just compounds. But it's not all doom and gloom, I promise you. There is a solve to some of these key challenges that we've been seeing in our compliance space. And that is Microsoft Information Protection. So when we work with organizations, and this is more looking at it from an overall information protection and governance stance, not necessarily just DLP or data loss prevention, but we'll come on to that. But it's really key to understand how to approach this stuff. So where do you start? You've got all these tools in Microsoft Information Protection to help. How do I go about it? The recommendation really is that you first start with knowing your data. Really understand what data you're sharing, what data is sensitive, and where that's being stored. And there's a couple of tools that can help you do this. There's things like the content search in the Compliance Admin Center. There is even creating a DLP policy and looking at some of the matches to that, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later on. There's also a Microsoft Information Protection Scanner, which is a tool that can scan all of your cloud data and any data on-premise to look at what's sensitive and where it's being stored. And it will pull up a big report to say, here's all your sensitive data, this is where it lives. So for example, if you've got a HR SharePoint site with lots and lots of personal information and employee numbers, you'll be able to use those tools to kind of pick out that and figure out where it's living and how it's being shared. So first of all, let's know our data. Let's use some of these tools to actually go in and find what's sensitive. Then looking at protecting your data. And what we mean by this is really it's like classifying and labeling that sensitive data. And if you think about different levels of data, will have different levels of severity. So you might have financial information as confidential and create labels to label all that content confidential. But then you might have personal information or client numbers or anything like that as highly confidential. So thinking about different levels of severity of sensitivity as well. Once we've figured out our classification, it's then looking at, protecting and preventing data loss. This is where our focus is going to lie today. This is looking at data loss prevention. And data loss prevention is really about protecting or trying to prevent accidental leakage of data. We're not there to assume malicious intent from all our users. We want to make sure that if somebody's trying to share information where they're not supposed to, we can, prevent it, we can educate them, and we can customize what happens, when that occurs. Finally, once we have put some protection around the data that we're classifying, the sensitive data that we figured out, we then want to think about governance. So I mentioned dark data. We've got huge amounts of information that we're working with. But to adhere to a lot of regulations, we do have to make sure we're disposing of data appropriately. So we can put retention policies in place to say, okay, I only want to store personal information for 7 years and then delete it after that point. So these are things that we can do in Microsoft 365 to help govern that information. So that's the life cycle and the approach. Find it, label it, classify it, protect it, and then govern it is the approach we recommend. But today we are focusing on prevent data loss. We're focusing on this kind of protect our data aspect. So to dig in deeper, what is it? What is data loss prevention? I've mentioned it a few times now. Some of you might be very familiar with it. Some of you might not have heard of it before, so we'll cover it just so we're all on the same page. So Microsoft's data loss prevention solution, it provides a broad range of capabilities. And the capabilities, a couple of key things is I mentioned the kind of prevention of data leakage. What we're trying to do here is create and customize policies to say that, okay, as an organization, the data that is sensitive to me is credit card information, SWIFT codes, and debit card numbers. I don't want that information to be shared externally. I don't want it to be stored in OneDrive or shared through email or shared in a Teams chat. I don't want lots and lots of that kind of sensitive data to be shared in certain ways. So I could put a data loss prevention policy in place to say if somebody does try to share lots of credit card numbers through a Teams chat or a Teams channel message or an email, then I want you to, and you can choose what happens. You can decide on preventing that from being shared. You can send alerts to the administrator if someone's sharing that information. You have a lot of choice of things that you can do. Now, the data loss prevention solution, it's quite nice because it does integrate with sensitivity labels. So if you were to label something as confidential, you could decide to then put a data loss prevention policy around that, anything that's labeled as confidential. And it works with some of the other tooling in Microsoft 365 security. So for those customers who are using Microsoft 365 E5, you can apply DLP policies to your devices, to your third-party apps that you might be using. So you could say, okay, I don't want people to be able to add this certain information to PDFs or to download things onto a USB or onto their device and so on. So it all integrates together. And just to, Bernice, I could see you got a quick question there. 80% of data is dark. What do I mean by that? I mean that our data is dark. We have it. We just don't know what it is or what, where it is. So if you think about, there's an organization I was speaking to, and they said they had something like 5 million files. It was ridiculous. It was a huge amount of information and data. They didn't know half of the things of what it was. It was just a huge amount of data that wasn't governed. It was sitting somewhere. It wasn't used. We didn't know if there was sensitive data in there or what it was. And so it was dark. It was just data that we had. We weren't doing anything with it. That's where the retention policies can come in handy, because we can get rid of the sensitive data after a certain period of time so we don't have that issue of dark data. But going back to DLP, the solution integrates, which is quite nice. But the focus for today is Teams. Microsoft DLP policies can be applied to Teams chat and channel messages. So we can block, educate, and customize. And that's really important. One, blocking certain things from being shared, and you can decide on high, medium, and low confidence ratings as well. So you could say if someone's sharing a 16-digit number with the word credit card next to it, and they're sharing it 3 or 4 times, that's when I want you to prevent that from being shared. So it's blocking, but we're also giving users some education. So there are policy tips that you can customize, and we'll take a look at that in a second. There's policy tips and emails that we can send out just to make sure users are aware, you shouldn't be sharing this information in Teams in a chat message, but you can share it in a labeled confidential file, for example. So making that decision around how you want your users to actually share that sensitive information is also important. Customization is key. You can totally customize your DLP policy, so you can apply it to certain groups of users. You could exclude certain groups of users. You could apply it to both Teams and channel messages. You can decide what happens if you just want to be alerted if an email gets sent to, a manager, or when a policy matches. It's completely up to you. One thing I would say when we're looking at data loss prevention is actually going in and turning on the policy and testing it is relatively simple to do. It's the bit before then. It's the discovery piece. It is figuring out what data is sensitive and how you want to protect it. Because the finance team, for example, might need to share credit card numbers, but the rest of the organization shouldn't be sharing that information. So you might want to exclude the finance team or create a different policy for them. Those types of things need to be confirmed, discussed, and decided on before starting to create some of these policies and turning on some of this technology. And that is always useful when you have input from different parts of the business, not just IT, in our experience anyway. But why do we need it? Why do we need DLP? So the idea I mentioned behind it is to prevent data leakage that's accidental. It's definitely not there, for malicious intent. If you put a policy in place to say, okay, we're going to block any credit card numbers from being shared externally, and that's obviously picking up like a 16-digit code, for example. If somebody splits up that number, they could take that information out if they really wanted to. You should start looking at insider risk if you want to look at some malicious intent things. When people are leaving their organization, they got a resignation date, they start deleting and downloading lots of stuff. That's insider risk. Data loss prevention is preventing that accidental leakage. One really, really key point is educating users. So sometimes it will be difficult to do lots of training on this type of stuff. Because there's lots of, users are just trying to get used to using Teams, using it properly. They're now working from home. They might have labels that they need to be trained on. You need to be trained on if there's phishing attacks and things like that. But with DLP, if somebody is trying to share information, it will stop them from doing it in a safe way, but it will also educate them and tell them how to do it properly. So it's kind of doing training as well as, making sure that information is not shared where it's not supposed to be. With DLP, we do not want to, impact productivity. For those people, people do need to share different types of sensitive information. There might be false positives as well. So we want to think about creating policies where, if someone's sharing lots of sensitive data, that's when we might enforce a policy. Not necessarily every time someone tries to share something that might be, there's a low confidence rating that it's sensitive. You'll just get lots of tickets from angry users who are trying to do their jobs. And I mentioned it complements the sensitivity labeling and protection. So if I create a document and it has financial information in it, I label it as sensitive or confidential. A DLP policy could be applied then to that document to prevent it either from being shared somewhere externally, stored in a certain place, prevent it from being downloaded to a USB or printed. It's completely up to you. But enough chatter. Let's take a look at it. Let's have a look at this technology I've just been talking about for 20 minutes and see how it works. We're going to look at it, first of all, from an admin perspective, then we'll look at the end user side. So first of all, we're going to access the Microsoft 365 Compliance Admin Center. There's a couple of things before we dive into creating a policy. I just wanted to point out a few things that, are crucial when it comes to, any compliance policy you create. And that is sensitive information types. So what I've done here is I've just navigated to the data classification tab on the left. And what you'll see in here is a tab called sensitive information types. Now, these are, as the name would suggest, sensitive types of information. But there are lots of different types of information that might be sensitive. Microsoft provide lots and lots of templates. The credit card number one that I keep using as an example is in here as a default, and you can search for your country, your location, and it will have sensitive information types, Australian passport number, physical address, and so on. So if I would search for the UK one because I'm based in the UK. Sometimes it doesn't like when I don't put a dot. There we are. I've got things like a UK passport number, National Health Service number, and so on. One thing I would highly recommend you do is create your own. And when you create your own sensitive information type, you can define what is sensitive to you, because a credit card number, financial information, personal information, these things are, some things that you might not deal with on a daily basis. But if you had employee numbers, client numbers, keywords that were sensitive, confidential projects, or, something that you defined as sensitive, you could go in and create your own sensitive information type. We actually had an organization, it's something it's such a specific use case, but they were in charge of, like the beef being sold around the globe, and the farms, and where the animals came from, and they had like an animal number for like a tag for each animal, and that is extremely sensitive information for them. So we created a sensitive information type, which was based on regular expression for those tags, so they could make sure that when they're being shared, they're being shared in the right way. So yeah, we could get there's some really specific use cases. But just to show you, if I was going to create my naming convention isn't going to be great with this. But just to show you as an example, if I was to create my own sensitive information type, I can create different patterns. So I could create a pattern for a high confidence level of this sensitive information. So for example, if you had one of your primary elements was a keyword, we've done some examples of this in the past where we've just tried out and used things like confidential or password or those types of keywords, but you might have project names, client names, it could be anything that you would deem sensitive. Obviously, we have regular expressions, so if there's particular codes or numbers that you use that are sensitive, we can add that in there as well. But if we had something like a high confidence rating, we could say, okay, it's a keyword list, and it's the word confidential as an example. We're going to do case insensitive because people might not use the capital C. And then we can add different supporting elements to it. So we can say, okay, if we have the primary, which is the word confidential, and a supporting element, so this could be the word password or something like that, then within 300 characters, then I think it's probably going to be this word that we're looking for. So if we were going to use credit card as an example, we would add our primary element as like a 16-digit number. And if it had the word credit card and within 300 characters, it's likely to be a credit card number. So we'll put that as high confidence as an example. Whereas I could change this and create a pattern for low confidence to say, okay, it's just a 16-digit number. If it's just a 16-digit number, it's a low confidence rating. And so we might have different, rules or things that happen if something is low confidence. You can totally customize that. You could add additional checks if you wanted to. So if things start or end with certain characters, if they have specific values, we could exclude and include. And we typically recommend creating a pattern for a high confidence level, medium, and low, depending on what type of sensitive data you have. But that's just a quick example. Create your own sensitive information type to really, start protecting data that's important to you. Okay, so we've decided on our sensitive data. What we're going to do is create a data loss prevention policy. So I'm going to go to data loss prevention on the left-hand side. And we're going to look at our policies. So in here, you can see that I have a few different, you can see I've used this as a demonstration before. And you can see I've got lots of different policies in there, some for personal data, some for custom sensitive information types. The financial data you can tell is my go-to with this one. We also have an order in here as well. Now, just to note, the order is quite important, and you can change the order of your policies. But for example, if you apply a policy to files, and a file has some personal information and it has financial information, which policy takes over? What's more sensitive? In this case, it's financial data. So if a file has personal information and financial data in it, I want you to use the policy for financial data because that is the data that's more sensitive. So the order is important when you are using data loss prevention policies. But let's go in and create a policy from scratch so we can show you some of the things that we can do with it. First of all, we need to look at our sensitive information types. So either use our custom one or a template. And you can see all the templates in here. The template I go for is our credit card number, SWIFT code, and debit card number. I'm going to hit next. We'll give it a name. Naming conventions are so important, and I just don't follow my own advice when I demonstrate these tools. I always use, financial data 1. Please create good naming conventions so you know what the policies mean and do. But for the purposes of my demo, I've just named it, financial data 8 because I've done this so many times. Okay, now DLP is asking me, where do you want to apply this policy? So you want to protect, financial data, but where? And you can choose Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and the one today is Teams, chat, and channel messages. Just to make you aware, in terms of the licensing, if you are on Microsoft 365 or Office 365 E3, you get OneDrive, SharePoint, and Exchange. You can apply DLP to those 3. Anything under is E5, and unfortunately, they all sit in different E5 SKUs. For example, this Teams, chat, and channel messages, to get this, you need to be on Office 365 E5. If you want to apply data loss prevention to devices, or you need to be on Windows 10 E5. If you want to apply it to third-party applications, you need to be on EMS E5 and so on. So the easiest bet is if you want all this, move to Microsoft 365 E5 to get all of it. Would be the safest bet, because they all sit in different E5 pockets from here below. The devices, obviously today we are focusing on Teams, chat, and channel messages, but the devices in the cloud, this is just such powerful technology, because if I had someone who was trying to, this is where we could look at someone downloading sensitive or financial data to a USB. They're printing something, they're trying to download something and save it locally. We can either audit or totally block that from happening on devices. If we're looking at cloud apps, we can say, okay, we're going to apply DLP policies to Box, Dropbox, Salesforce, Adobe, third-party applications. And these are, and even on-premise repositories. These are really, really great because we're putting that loop around our security. It's really difficult now with people moving data into apps we have no control over and to different devices. This will help with that. So although it's not the focus for today, you could do a whole day on this stuff. Not the focus for today, but if you're on E5, this is some, really, really powerful technology. So we'll use these as an example. I do want to keep SharePoint sites in there and OneDrive because if I'm an organization using Teams, I'm also using SharePoint sites for files that are shared in Teams. I'm also using files in OneDrive that are shared in Teams chat. So I probably want to keep these on if I was going to apply a policy here, but of course you can just choose to apply it to Teams chat and channel messages. You'll see that we have the option to include or exclude certain groups. So again, if you've got a finance team who really need to be sharing lots of this type of data, you might want to exclude them from this policy. So we have some default settings that we can use, but I'm going to look at some of the advanced rules. So I can just show you some of the options and things that you can customize. So in here, we're going to create rules. And there are rules here that we have. So for example, if there's a low volume of content detected. If there's a low amount of credit card numbers or debit card numbers in Teams, Exchange or SharePoint or OneDrive, we can decide what happens. And the reason why you might want to have a low and high confidence rating for these is, again, because of that user productivity. People do need to work and share sensitive data. If you did want to totally lock it down, you could just say, okay, if there's even one time someone's trying to share a credit card number, stop them from sharing it, do all this stuff. It's not what we're trying to do. And so what we would want to do is really create rules for that low and high confidence level. So I can see in here if there's a low amount of data detected, and that data is 1 to 9. So if there's 1 to 9 counts of a credit card number, then I want you to do X. You can decide what happens. You'll notice that there's a high, and medium and low confidence rating. So for example, if my 16-digit number has the word credit card number within 300 digits, it's probably a credit card number, so it's high confidence. But of course, you could decide to also have things happen for low confidence levels and low instances of data as well. If you really wanted to find out, and be notified every time someone's trying to, they might be sharing a credit card number 1 or 2 times, you could decide to do that. Not recommended massively, because who wants to be, notified every single time that happens, but you might be if it's really sensitive data. And that's why, remember when I said create your custom sensitive information type and have a low, medium, and high confidence rating. So then you can, with your custom one, you'll have those options as well. You can customize the instance counts. So for low instances, you could say, okay, for us, low is 1 to 50 or 1 to 20. It doesn't have to be 1 to 9. Then what I could decide to do is say, okay, if this data is found and it's in this either SharePoint site file, if it's in a Teams chat or channel message, and if it's trying to be shared with people outside my organization, I want you to add an action and do something about that. If you really want to lock things down, which again, the idea is not to lock things down too much, but you could say, okay, even with people inside my organization. And this is the option I actually chose for the purposes of a demo. So if somebody tries to share a Teams, a message through Teams chat internally, then it's still going to put this policy in place. You could add exceptions. You could say, okay, but if the content contains, these words, then I want you to just ignore it. If it's shared, from a certain place, Microsoft 365, then of course we can put exceptions in there. In terms of the actions, because we have, chosen the Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, we can restrict access or encrypt the content. So we can decide to block people outside the organization from being able to access that content, or block everyone. And I will show you what that looks like from the end user. So if they try to share an email, if they try to share a file from SharePoint, it's not going to let them do it because we're putting this action to block things. And I could choose to block everyone, which means only people with existing access to that data can go in and have it shared to them, or just if you want to focus on keeping your data inside the organization, this is another option as well. Now, user notifications is the educate piece. So what we're looking at here is, do we want to send notifications to users to help them? I would highly recommend you do. You can customize the policy tip that is shared to users. So I can customize that policy tip. Again, I'll show you where the policy tips are found from the end users. You can choose to send a notification to certain people if you wanted to add, we've seen before people copy in managers when these policies are matched, just to make them aware that maybe their staff needs just awareness or training because they're trying to share information, not in the proper way. What we can also do is add incident reports. So we can say, okay, if this happens, I want to be alerted, but I only want to be alerted if this happens, 15 or more times. So again, you don't want to necessarily get your admins to get emails and notifications every time someone tries to share information. You may want to, but you could define that just to make it a little bit more manageable, but you can set up alerts as granular as you really need when a policy is matched. And then we have the priority, which I mentioned before. So I'm going to save that. It's not going to like me not actually clicking on anything. So let me save. Of course, it doesn't like me to do this. We'll cancel that for now. We do have the high volume. So in this one, you can see the count is 10 to 500. So someone's really trying to share lots of this sensitive data. So you might want to, this is where you might want to say, okay, block access to certain people from especially outside the organization. Again, you can customize this as well. So for you, if high levels or high volume is 10 to 20, then of course you can customize that as well. Again, for my demo, I've actually put 1-to-1 so I can show you exactly how it works. Test it out. Always test out. If you're creating a DLP policy, test it out first. Make sure you show the policy tips while you're testing so you can see what the user will see. It's highly recommended before you turn it on, because if you turn it on and people start, you maybe not set something up properly and things start getting blocked, you'll get lots of tickets, lots of users not being able to do what they need to do. So always test out your DLP policy. But that was just what can we do with it? There's a lot of control that we have around our actions, exceptions, when we actually get notified, what the email looks like to our end users when they're getting educated. So those are some of the things that we can do. But hopefully by going through that back end side of it, you'll see how much there is to really just define before you turn the policy on. You need to have made some decisions around your data and your company policies. I would just say there's a couple of things in here as well to help you. So the alerts I mentioned that you can set up, you can get a report of the alerts in here, but there is in the reports in your compliance admin center. When there are policy matches, you do have some nice reports to kind of show you your organizational data. So in here, you can see your policy matches, the incidents, any false positives. You can also, I didn't mention this, but you can allow your users to override policies. So if it is a false positive and they do need to share that information, it's not sensitive, even though DLP is picking up that it's sensitive, then they can override it. So again, you're not blocking that user productivity, but you do get reports on when that happens. And then if I scroll down, this is where we're starting to look at more of the E5 stuff when it comes to discover different third-party apps that are being used, where there's third-party data data on third-party apps. Sorry, there's device. Scroll down. There's devices as well. What devices are people trying to download our stuff or sensitive information to? So you do get a bit of reporting in there. You can go into each of these as well and really get to find kind of when it happened, who it was, and so on if you needed to. But let's take a look from the end user perspective. So I put this DLP policy in place. And I, as an end user, let's start with Teams. So I'm in Microsoft Teams. I'm in a channel. And it could be a case of, this channel or this team has external and guest users in it that I might not be aware of as a user. And you can see an example here. Let's just copy and paste that just to show you it working. So you can see an example here where someone's just tried to share one instance of a credit card number, and you can see it's a 16-digit code in there. So if I just type this in as a message as an end user, because I've created a DLP policy which says if there's one instance of someone, one bit of volume of someone sharing that credit card number, block it from being shared. Block it from being shared inside the organization and outside. And this is what will happen if you create a really tight kind of policy like that. As soon as I try to share credit card number one time in any kind of team, any channel, any chat message, it's not going to let me. It's going to block it. It's going to tell me the message was blocked, and it's got a little what can I do button. So this is where I have information about this item was protected. This is the policy tip you can customize. You could choose to report it to your admin. This also works in Teams chat. You can see in here, I've just tried to, let's do that again. I tried to share some credit card information, but because we've applied it to Teams chat and channel messages, it's blocked. But I also get a notification to say it's blocked as a user. I also can see it in my activity feed to say that the message has been blocked. It's not been sent because it's violating a policy from the organization. Now, because we applied this policy to SharePoint, we also have protection around our files. So if I just navigate to a different team and I go to my files, you'll be able to see in my files, I have a file called credit card info. I've not been very creative with my naming conventions here. And you can see a little icon next to it. So I can see this document contains sensitive information. If I go in and I open that up as a user, you'll see it's got a few different bits of confidential information in this file, and it's got a policy tip at the top. So it's telling me that this item's protected by my organization. Now, DLP is automatic. So as soon as I add that sensitive information, the DLP policy is going to be applied. Depending on if you've said, okay, only if they're sending 10 instances of a credit card number, that's when you should apply the policy. But it's automatic from the user. It's not like manual sensitivity labeling or anything like that. It will happen as the user puts that sensitive information in. So we can click on more options and it'll take us to the SharePoint site where this file is located, and I have the policy tip on the right hand side. I can see again, you could customize this. I can see the issues, the compliance regulation it's hitting, and so on. And how this item is actually blocked from being shared with people inside my organization. In terms of the blocking and how it works, so you'll see here I've got a finance document. Again, it's got the same icon. If I click on that and I go to share, I put a policy in place to say block from everyone. So don't share it with people inside or outside the organization. So that means when I try to share it, the only option I have is to share it with people with existing access. I cannot share it with external people or even other people in the organization. It's only people with access to this file. If I was to click on a file that doesn't have the DLP policy, this document, you'll see when I click share, I can actually share that with specific people. So that's external. With people in my organization, these are not grayed out. So that's kind of how, we can block things from being shared if we need to, if they're sensitive. So from an end user perspective, they'll get the policy tip. They can get an email as well. So if they do try to share something, you can make an email be sent, as we talked about. But it's all about making sure that we're not hindering our end users, but also protecting our information from being shared. And again, if you go up to the M365E5, you can apply that to devices, on-prem repositories, as well as third-party apps and teams. So that's what it looks like from an end user perspective. To just finish up, because we're looking all right on time, there's some new stuff that I wanted to mention. So there is a new DLP policy that controls, well, basically DLP controls that you can add to restrict access to sensitive files based on file extension and file type. So this is where we're creating rules to protect sensitive information, but the condition is that it's a specific file extension or a file type. This gets quite cool because we can start looking then at things like Teams meeting recordings and videos, because we can define now the file extension. So this is relatively new, that's been released. And we can then monitor, obviously, when that sensitive files have been added, or even if they're stored in archives. We can restrict access to archives as well if they contain sensitive information. So there's a few customizations to the DLP rules that are being introduced, worth keeping an eye out. The devices piece that I kept going on about, but definitely worth looking at. So there's endpoint data loss prevention. And that really just extends the monitoring and the protection of DLP that to items that are physically stored on Windows 10, Windows 11, and even Mac devices as well. So you're able to audit, you can manage when a user uploads an item to a restricted service domain. If they try to copy information to an app, it detects when a user attempts to copy information to a USB or a Bluetooth device, and so much more. Finally, on the what's new, there's a Chrome browser DLP extension. So this is where we're looking at that's part of the insider risk management solution. So again, it's all E5, but you get a lot in there. So you can basically create the DLP capabilities within Chrome, within the Chrome browser. So you can see here, if I've got a PDF, I'm dragging it putting it into Chrome. It's got sensitive information in it. It's protected and it's handled from, I'm trying to print it, my DLP policy is popping up to say you can't do this because of this. User can override it and give a justification. Again, you have the choice whether you allow your people to do that or not. So some really exciting stuff coming to DLP, stuff that's already available now. That is, really, really exciting. But lastly, I did want to end on licensing. So licensing for DLP, I mentioned E5. So the Teams and chat and channel messages specifically as an Office 365 E5 feature. So if you have M365 E5, there is a compliance add-on which incorporates these elements if you did want to purchase that and you didn't want to move fully to M365 E5, that's fine. You would also need either Office 365 E5 to be able to do that. So Teams DLP is a specific Office 365 E5, which comes in these two as well. So if you are looking at it, it's either an add-on or upgrading if you're not already on E5, just to make you aware of that. And that concludes the Teams DLP session for today. I hope you found it useful. Thank you again so much to our sponsors for the event. And there was one question that came through the chat, but I will hold on. If there are any more, please feel free, pop them in the chat now. I'm more than happy to answer them in the little bit of time that we have left. But thank you so much for listening. Hope you found it useful, and I hope you're as excited about DLP as I am.
Great. Thank you, Kat. It was really, really good and cool things to see live.
Can't beat a demo. Can't beat seeing it working. That's great. Okay, so only add-on. Yep. So I knew I'd get some licensing questions. It always happens, but it's fair enough. So yes, if you're on Office 365 E3, then you could buy this M365 compliance add-on. So you would get the E5 compliance specific features. You could also do that if you were on Microsoft 365 E3, that's when you could buy that add-on as well. If you've already got Office 365 E5, you could buy this add-on, but you'll have Teams DLP in here. So if it's just Teams DLP you're after, you wouldn't need to buy an add-on for this. But if you were on Office 365 E3, M365 E3 or lower, then yes, you'd be looking to buy the add-on then. I hope that clears that up. We can share these slides with you as well, so you do have a little reference to the, and this, I'll send a link in the chat actually to this. There's a guy who does the licensing maps, and they're so comprehensive. They just, I live by them. So I'll post that, I'll get that up now and post it in the chat for you. So that'll be helpful, hopefully demystify the licensing. Wonderful. Are there any more questions before we finish the session? See, when there aren't many questions, you've either explained something very well or very poorly. It's always one or the other. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll stop there then. Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed running the session. Hopefully you found it useful and can't wait for the next one. Thanks, everyone.